Today's topic we're going to discuss is the debate on India in English Parliament, which deals directly with India being subjugated under the East India Trading Company rule. Written by M. Le Comte de Montalembert, or otherwise known as Charles Forbes René Montalembert, his English name, a French author who resided in London for most of his life. The document expresses his viewpoints and opinions on the East India Trading Company control in India from 1765 to 1857. This document was written in 1858, a time where India was revolting against the British East India Trading Company, fighting for their freedom. This allows us to analyze the events leading up to how the East India Trading Company came to rule India and go further in depth on the author's interesting viewpoints and how the British governing India was beneficial to Indian lives, especially in comparison to the treatment of other countries like Spain. We will also discuss why, specifically, the East India Trading Company wanted to take control over India. The document was written to not only present Montalembert's opinion to the French people, but to also defend the actions of the East India Trading Company and further declare support for the English crown. This document creates a false illusion that portrays English control over India as being a best-case scenario. Charles Forbes René de Montalembert, a French nobleman that was born in London, is the author of Debate on India in English Parliament. His father served in the English cavalry and was even chosen to announce King Louis XVIII in the French monarchy. Due to his father's work as an ambassador, Montalembert was mainly raised by his grandfather. His grandfather made many journeys to India and wrote memories of these trips. These memories included the Oriental memoirs and the reflections of the character of the Hindus and the necessity of converting them to Christianity. These memoirs help us to see into the life of young Montalembert and how he was raised in a very religiously stout home. Montalembert spent many of his younger years living in England. It was not until the start of college where Montalembert takes off his career as an opinionated writer on the state having control over the church. He saw that it was necessary for them to be separate. Montalembert was arrested on multiple occasions of different writings he published in different countries such as Ireland. One of the key factors that helped spark the rebellion in India in 1858 was when the Indians suspected the British were using pig and cow fat in the Indians' weapons. This was very important to Indian culture and religion because they considered those animals sacred. Using such oils and fat for something so vile as killing and weapons was detrimental and ultimately the demise of the East India Trading Company. This was the last straw for the Indian people as they started a mutiny on May 10, 1857, at the military barracks in Meerut. All classes of Indian people rose up against the company. Rich, poor, and working class no longer were separate, and they joined together to beat out the East India Trading Company. After the company was thrown out of India by British Parliament, a new government arose within India called the British East India Trading Company lost its power in India. British Parliament decided that it was best for them to have a direct role in India's growth and development. During the Raj rule, there was a modernization of transportation communication systems. These helped transform the country into an integrated colonial state. The Raj wanted to strengthen India's trading routes. Therefore, they started manufacturing public works such as railways, dams across rivers, and a huge assortment of telegraph lines throughout the nation. This developed a better source of communication, which helped strengthen trade. This developed India into a major consumer of British goods and a supplier of an array of products such as cotton, tea, and wheat. The reform efforts of the Raj made it into a unified territory and enabled its inhabitants to identify themselves as Indians. But they would stay under British colonial rule, so the Indians were not fully capable of experiencing basic civil, and human rights, and elite members still lacked the right to vote. Montalembert claims specifically that in a majority of the cases, Indians were responsible for the torturing that occurred during the rebellion in 1857. The company tried to find the oppressors of the natives responsible to punish them for their actions. However, a picture taken in 1858, shown in The Last Empire, Photography in British India, proves these accusations to be incorrect. Taken during the Indian Mutiny, the hanging of two rebels says 1,000 words about the injustice that took place towards rebels that were against the company rule. Not only does the picture feature the responses the company took towards the rebels, an excerpt from the article, Transformations of India After the Indian Mutiny, also shows the inaccuracy of Montalembert's claim. The company's rule over India was beneficial. Such traumatic and widely reported events as the killing of women in the Bibigar at Kanpur, the siege of Lucknow, and the killing of the garrison at Jhansi all contributed to a change in attitudes of the Indian population. Sensational media reports focused in particular on the fate of the British women and children and contributed to an initial revulsion and desire for revenge against the East India Trading Company in India. These events were also seen as a justification for the acts of reprisal, such as those carried out under the command of Colonel James Neal, when soldiers burned villages and put Indians, in many cases not involved in the initial conflict, to death by hanging. Another claim made in this document was that the colonization of India under British East India Trading Company rule would be much better than the colonization of India of any other country, specifically Spain. Montalembert takes opposition against claims that declare the East India Trading Company cruel in terms of ruling over India and compares the company's colonization techniques to those of Spain, saying that India should be grateful their rulers were the amiable ones. He cites the example of how horribly the Spaniards have treated the Native Americans from Columbus's and Cortez's expenditures. The main reason the East India Trading Company occupied India was because they were losing money in its expenditures to colonize and industrialize the surrounding European countries. This left Britain with a large amount of debt, which they needed to decrease as fast as possible. This led the East India Trading Company to tax its colonies harshly, including America. Britain also saw India as a jewel in the crown. This meaning that the India, even though it was not a part of the mother country, it still helped advance the economic growth and capital of Britain because of its strong economic position. India was a smart way to help decrease Britain's debt. This drain on the India economy caused harsh living conditions and slowed down the process of India getting industrialized and more modernized, which is what Britain wanted. They wanted a colonized state that they could use and monitor without much retaliation. The colonial estate would pay for the motherland's expenses through its surplus of production, like our author says in this book. He thinks that the company's rule in India was because Britain wanted to expand self-government throughout Asia and European countries, but this is untrue. India wasn't deindustrialized, therefore used, and had to pay more labor to produce the commodities that Britain demanded. While Britain could produce the exchange of goods at a much faster pace and a much more efficient pace, British wages could be lowered thanks to new inventions during the Industrial Revolution. But these inventions were not made available to Indian cities. The company used the Indian population to compete and fulfill the commodities of the British. With the abolition of slavery in Britain, there was a huge shortage of workers. Luckily for Britain, India had a large population to fill in the gaps. Britain forced many Indian people who indentured servitude and with harsh conditions, almost defining slave work. Millions were sent across the globe to fulfill needs and desires for work. Since India was such a huge trading outpost, the company wanted to restrict how much influence and contact India had with other neighboring countries. This included trade. The company made their presence known on the coast so that they could harbor and monitor the trade from India. From the coast, they moved into the heart of India, establishing themselves for the next 50 years. The company also enacted laissez-faire, free trade, but all trade had to go through the company's regulations, so it wasn't really free. Far from a benefit to Indian lives. The British used the Indian population, natural resources, and trade location to help aid the East India Trading Company, and the company alone. All three concepts could have benefited India if the resources were expendable enough for them to take control and advantage of their own land. However, Britain's strict governing of the country resulted in fewer revolts and fewer rebellions with the notion of reclaiming their land. They were able to maintain power in India after a mutiny resulting in the deaths of potentially 800,000 Indian civilians. In conclusion, Montalembert's opinion that the British rule was beneficial for India was falsely justified. Throughout these secondary sources, as well as Montalembert's background, we can see factual evidence supporting the factors that these claims were inaccurate. The role of the East India Trading Company dehumanized the Indian people and vastly stole away their rights. The Indian Mutiny, although it did not result in victory, did change the rule of India from the company to the British Raj, where they constructed railways, rivers, river dams, and telegraph lines. Although the East India Trading Company was ruthless to the Indian people, their direct interference with Indian culture did help in boosting the Indian society to keep up with the rapidly growing Western European countries. Once the Raj took over, they actually inspired the Indian people in helping them build their own nation. Needless to say, Britain still benefited greatly from India, which was the biggest reason for helping them industrialize. Indians' rebellion is the perfect example of imperial colonialism in Montalembert's opinionated document. He tries to paint a picture of the Indian people enjoying the company's rule, but hopefully after all these facts and sources we have provided, we hope you think otherwise. Thank you. This was